My dearest students of course A403 on Work Values and Ethics, welcome. This is a continued lecture on Chapter 6 that handles the compliance approaches. So now we move on to how organizations can enforce their codes of ethics. Well, before talking about the different mechanisms that might be used for enforcing codes of ethics, it is important to realize that there should be a balance between encouraging good conduct within the organization and also adopting policing behavior. By policing behavior, we mean acting like a policeman, where you are looking at whether your employees are abiding by the codes or not. So you are somehow looking for mistakes or the extent to which your employees abide by the codes. While as encouraging good conduct involves training them, involves having discussions and so on. So the following are different ways to enforce codes of ethics inside the organization. So number one is adopting law enforcement. Make sure that all your employees abide by the different laws, of course, and if not, then they should be subject to punishment or sanctions. This is actually an example of policing behavior. Another example of policing behavior is resorting to wide independent investigative bodies where they would investigate the different ethical behavior inside your organization. Whether these investigative bodies were internal, working inside the organization, such as the committees of ethics or the ombudsman or ethical auditing people or officials and so on, or whether they were external to the organization like الرقابة الإدارية النيابة الإدارية الجهاز المركزي للمحاسبات and so on. Okay, this is also, as I said, another kind of policing behavior. However, examples of encouraging good conduct would be the use of preventative management controls, where you would try to make sure that your employees would not commit an ethical act. So you would try to prevent unethical acts inside your organization. So in that case, you might, for example, have training programs on your code of ethics, training programs or workshops on the different ethical dilemmas that the employees might be facing and how they can apply the code of ethics on these circumstances and so on. Another example of encouraging good conduct could be used through having transparency mechanisms where you would have open discussions about the ethical dilemmas that the organization is facing and how people should behave in these circumstances and why certain decisions were taken and according to which rules or to which principles and so on. So try to have transparency inside the organization so that people would know why things are run in the way they are run and understand how they also are supposed to behave. Also, try to raise the awareness of your employees. We said that many ethical issues are like gray zones where you cannot simply decide whether this is an ethical or unethical act. But if you increase the awareness of your employees about the different possible ethical dilemmas that they might be facing, well, then this is an important aspect, okay? And this will definitely help you to enforce your codes of ethics. Also, a last point of encouraging good conduct would be developing skills, like helping your employees to develop skills with regard to analyzing the different ethical conditions, or to solve the different ethical problems, or, for example, to make decisions when faced with unethical issues. By developing their skills, you would make sure that they would also have good conduct or at least would be encouraged to have good conduct inside the organization. With regard to how codes are implemented and enforced in the different countries, well, in many public organizations worldwide, you can see that they would either have codes of ethics or ethical principles mentioned in different laws. For example, when we have laws organizing corruption and so on, you don't necessarily um, have or have the need to create a code of ethics, because most of the cases handling corruption are already discussed in many laws. So, in that case, we can see that in many public organizations, sometimes they might have codes of ethics, or they also would have different pieces of law that handle ethical issues that are familiar, that might be repetitive, and so on. Okay? Or we could have both codes of ethics and also laws trying to regulate ethical issues. In other countries, we might also have additional laws for um, ethical issues. So these would be separate laws that handle certain ethical issues, such as whistleblowing or freedom of information and transparency. However, for you, it is important to know that no codes are static, no codes are long lasting. They might change dependent on the contingencies that the organization is facing, okay, and also dependent on how regulatory or aspirational they are. If they are too strict, then most probably the organization would need to change them as much as the environment, the external environment, is changing. But if they are somehow broad in their sense, to be applicable to the different circumstances, then an organization would not need to change it so often or frequent as those organizations with very regulatory codes of ethics. If we're talking about aspirational codes, maybe they're too general to be applied, and maybe at some point of time, management or the employees would start requesting having a more precise code of ethics. In general, for you to know that codes of ethics are not static, they develop, they might be changing depending on the context in which the organization exists. Now, what do codes address? Or you can say, what are the basic components of any code of ethics? Well, there are basically three components. Number one, most of the codes would mention the type of offense. So they would mention different statements telling people how to behave. And if they don't behave accordingly, then this would be considered as a kind of offense or a kind of misconduct or unethical behavior. A second component would be the sanctions that are mentioned in case an individual is behaving unethically or is violating the ethical codes or is simply resorting to unethical acts in the organization. A third component, which is also very important, is mentioning the institution or the individuals who are going to impose these sanctions on the employees. These might be external institutions like anti-corruption agencies, for example, or they might be people from within the organization, like when we talk about the ethical ethics officials or ethical audit people, and so on. Or sometimes we have the committees of values and or committees of conduct. So these people would simply investigate the unethical act and impose sanctions on the employees and make sure that they would be treated also in a fair way. Taking the different parts of or components of codes of ethics in more detail, we discuss the type of offense that might be mentioned in any code of ethics. Well, a code of ethics might mention illegal behaviors, such as, for example, corruption or bribes, or handling or treating customers in an unfriendly way, indecent way, and so on. So here you would find a code of ethic mentioning illegal behavior, things that are against the rules and regulation. Or they might also mention ethical behavior, especially if they're following a positive tone. So treat the customers fairly, in a transparent way, in a friendly way, be patient, something like this, or be fair, and so on. Or they might also mention inappropriate behavior, which are against normal convention. These are not necessarily unethical or illegal, but they are against the normal customs, traditions, what people are used to behave. Um, uh, it's against the norms, like talking loud, something like this, or not having eye contact with the person whom you are addressing or speaking to. So, this is something that is inappropriate. As for the sanctions, well, it is important to make sure that your sanctions are equivalent or appropriate to the offense, not greater than the offense, not less. So, not too strict or too hard on the employees and not too lenient. And therefore, they should be also reviewed regularly to confirm whether they are appropriate or not. And it's also important to determine how many times to breach the code before imposing sanctions. Of course, some of the organizations might impose the sanctions right away from the very first act, while many other organizations might start to use incremental implementation of these sanctions. For example, they might start warning the employee and then or reprimand them, or simply then, if the employee repeats the act for a third time, then they would impose the sanction in the end. As for the third component of the code of ethics, well, here we regard who is to impose these sanctions. And in many countries, you might find that codes of ethics would simply say that it is the courts who shall impose the sanctions in case an employee committed an unethical act. Or they might refer to an ombudsman, who is simply somebody inside the organization investigating unethical behavior of the different employees, and he or she might impose those sanctions on the employee. And they might be an individual or a committee, as I said before. And also, we could have a central body dealing with fraud, like النيابة الإدارية or الرقابة الإدارية and so on, or any further anti-corruption agencies that might investigate any unethical behavior. Now, finally, to wrap up the talk about codes of ethics, it's again important to know that codes are important, but they are not sufficient. So they are alone not enough. They should be part of a wider ethical framework that includes the organizational culture, that might also include leadership within the organization, and so on. And also be embedded in the human resources strategy. So when we evaluate, when we recruit, when we promote our human resources, we should also consider their ethical behavior and evaluate their performance accordingly. And also, these codes should be also embedded in the service delivery strategy, meaning when you deal with your customers and suppliers, of course, etc., you've got to behave in an ethical way. So ethical behavior should not just be confined to the organization, but it also should be targeted towards the external environment, especially when you deliver your services and goods to your customers and clients. Also, training and education are very important because you would socialize your people, your employees on the codes and the different statements and sanctions that are mentioned in these codes. And you would, through education and training, help them to understand and interpret the different statements and so on. Also, it is important to have external and internal accountability or auditing, ethical auditing, whether by people from within the organization, from inside the organization, or from outside the organization to ensure their autonomy and objectivity. Furthermore, codes need to have a balance between regulation and aspiration. So they shouldn't be too detailed nor too general. They should find a place in between where they can explain or cover as many ethical examples as possible, but also can be general in a way that allows their interpretation in different contexts and also allows their implementation in different contexts. So, to make it as flexible as possible. And they need also to balance between national codes, professional codes, and the local or the organizational codes. So there should be harmony between what is national and what is local when it comes to these codes. And also, they should be comprehensive, mentioning different practices as possible, while as also selective. They should be selective in order to stress on the ethical or unethical aspects of these different practices. Finally, it is better to build the codes bottom up. So, in order to involve the different stakeholders, to make them understand the importance of these codes, the content of these codes, and make them participate in developing them. And when doing so, you would prevent them from seeing these codes as a control mechanism. In fact, you would make them feel ownership of these codes and thereby having their commitment to implement and abide by these codes. Now, moving on to the anti corruption agencies, which are also part of the compliance approach. Well, it is important to know that their tasks include receiving and responding to complaints. So, employees might simply complain about unethical acts to those anti corruption agencies. And also, another task would be to administer registers of interests and asset declarations. So, we all know that public employees in Egypt have to submit their files on الذمة المالية, okay, to الكسب الغير مشروع in order to demonstrate what they own, okay, and from which sources were they able to buy these assets or properties and so on, okay. We could consider actually the previous tasks, so receiving and responding to complaints as well as administering registers of interest and asset declaration, as part of their oversight role that we have discussed earlier in this chapter. A third task would be to investigate complaints. So when they receive complaints, they need to investigate whether these complaints are true and really reveal unethical act, or they are just hoax. Okay, so they have to investigate the matter. And in case these complaints were investigated and proven to be correct, then those anti-corruption agencies might have the right to prosecute and impose sanctions on the relevant organizations or the relevant employees and so on. Okay, it depends, of course, on the type of the anti-corruption agency and the type of powers that it has. Not all anti-corruption agencies have this authority of prosecution and imposing sanctions. They might only have the ability to receive complaints and reveal information regarding it, but not all of them have the right to prosecute and impose sanctions. A third task, which is more related to guidance, is related to offering or conducting research and analysis about ethical behavior in general, leading to dissemination of good practices. So, how to avoid corruption, or how to build trust among your employees, and how to ensure integrity in the organization, etc. Also, they might use preventive measures in terms of ethics training and so on. For example, while offering training and guidance and support information, etc., as well as having education community engagement, people might start to learn how to behave in the different ethical dilemmas before they witness these ethical dilemmas. So, in that case, you are adopting here preventive measures rather than taking reactive measures. Okay, so the last 2 points with regard to research and analysis as well as adopting preventive measures, okay, could be considered as part of the guiding role of the anti-corruption agencies. Again, not all anti-corruption agencies follow these three basic tasks that are divided here into six um, um, minor points, but many of them do more than one of these three tasks. Now, basically, those anti corruption agencies would be concerned with corruption. This is why they are called also anti corruption agencies. Corruption is basically the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So, a corrupted person would have a kind of power or authority that is entitled to him by his position inside the organization, and he would misuse or exploit this authority in order to achieve private interests or private gains. Therefore, we can simply follow a formula for corruption, which is as follows. C stands for corruption is equivalent to monopoly of authority, meaning that the individual has a kind of monopoly over this authority. Only few people, if any, except this person, would have this kind of authority. So whenever a person has monopoly over a kind of authority, okay, then all the other people or all the other customers would have to resort to him. Okay, plus, in case he had also discretion or autonomy over how to use this authority, then this means that he can decide how to work and how to use this kind of authority. And in case there was no accountability, which is minus A here, minus accountability, less accountability, then this means that this person has control over certain kinds of authority and has also discretion in determining how to use this authority with no oversight on how to behave. Then, according to this formula, the chance of having corruption is very high. With regard to the examples of anti-corruption agencies we mentioned before, مثلا النيابة الإدارية، الرقابة الإدارية, we could also have الجهاز المركزي للمحاسبات, and these are somehow national agencies, but we also have international agencies such as the Transparency International. And I urge you to just check their website and see what they do. This is an international organization that has branches in over 90 countries, and it tries to rank the different countries based upon the level of transparency and corruption that exists in these countries. Try to have a look, it might be interesting. As for the different types of anti-corruption agencies, well, as we mentioned, the Transparency International is, for example, a universal anti-corruption agency. It works in different countries and it ranks the different countries based upon the level of transparency and corruption, etc. We might also have investigative models involving a small centralized unit. For example, we would have a committee inside an organization, or also a centralized apparatus like الجهاز المركزي للمحاسبات in Egypt, for example. This is a small centralized apparatus, not unit, but it investigates the different organizations and their ethical behavior and ethical conduct, of course. Okay? Or we could have a small centralized unit within the organization itself. Okay? A third example might be the parliamentary model, where we would have the parliament overseeing and investigating the performance of the different public organizations, for example. And we also might have a multi-agency model that involves the previously mentioned different types and combines them together. So it can be like having a parliamentary model and also a small centralized unit, etc. Okay? These are basically the four types of anti-corruption agencies. So the success of the agencies, of these anti-corruption agencies, depends on several factors. One of these factors is their independence. These organizations have to be independent and immune from any possible retaliations. Also, they should not be subject to any kind of influence in order to be objectives as much as possible in their work and to be able to investigate unethical behavior in the different organizations. Another factor would be to have wide ranging investigative powers, so not to have very limited authorities when it comes to investigating ethical behavior. For example, like you have only the right to check our documents, which wouldn't necessarily reveal the unethical behavior, but maybe they should also be allowed to conduct interviews or to collect data from different sources. The wider the range of these investigative powers, the more successful the anti-corruptions are going to be. A third factor would be to have dedicated and professional staff. If you have dedicated staff that are committed to revealing unethical behavior or conduct inside the organization, then the anti-corruption agency is going to be successful and efficient. Because actually investigating ethical behavior is something that takes time and effort and requires strong motivation to do so. So, especially if the organization is external to the organization. So, in that case, you need to have dedicated and professional staff. A fourth factor would be following a three-pronged approach that includes investigation, investigating the different ethical behavior, as well as prevention. And we said that those anti-corruption agencies might resort to workshops, training, education in order to prevent the employees from committing unethical acts. Or education, again, to have workshops that reveal how the different employees should behave, what they should avoid, and make sure that they would not fall into the trap of these unethical acts and so on. Okay, so they should follow investigation, prevention, and education. A fifth factor would be having public support. The higher the public support to those anti-corruption agencies, the more successful these anti-corruption agencies are going to be, because they would feel that the people are supporting them and that they are appreciating their efforts and that they highly value their work and so on. So this would motivate them to keep on their work and to reveal ethical behavior or unethical behavior, etc. Also, a very important factor for the success of these anti-corruption agencies is to participate in international and regional fora to update their knowledge, to know the different practices that should be followed, or the different or the most up-to-date and recent practices, whether ethical practices or unethical practices. For example, now we see online crimes, online ethical problems and so on. So for those organizations to be always up to date and so on, and to be able to handle the different ethical or unethical problems, they need to participate in international and regional fora in order to update their knowledge and update also their skills of investigation, prevention, and education. Other additional factors that are not necessarily related to the anti corruption agencies themselves, but are rather external to them and help them to become successful are, for example, having the political will and support. If the political system is supporting those anti corruption agencies in their efforts and in their work, then most probably these anti corruption agencies will be efficient and successful. But if this political will is not existent, then they would not be motivated to reveal any unethical act. Another aspect which is external to these anti corruption agencies would be having adequate financial resources allocated to those anti corruption agencies to allow them to perform better, to update their skills, their practices, their work, etc. Okay? A third factor would be access to documentation, which might be backed by the different rules, different laws that might be imposed in order to ensure that they would have the capacity to investigate ethical performance in the different organizations and have access to the different documentations and sources of information. And fourth, which is be supported by laws. So, of course, if those anti corruption agencies are supported by the laws, which are the most important rules in any country, then no organization would be able to oppose their performance or would simply dissent their investigation rights and so on. And they would all have to comply to those anti corruption agencies and reveal their information and their documentations. Also, adding to the previously mentioned additional factors, we can mention also the importance of having comprehensive anti corruption legislation, which are kinds of laws that are focusing on how to prevent corruption or how to reveal corruption and handle corruption and so on. Of course, if these legislations exist, then this would facilitate the work of the anti corruption agencies as well. Also, having legal tools to support investigation, like having the right to, for example, investigate um, in a spontaneous way the different organizations without prior notice, for example, something like these. So, whenever they have the legal tools that support their investigation powers, this would facilitate their performance and also be independent from any political interference. And this is why we previously mentioned the importance of having political will and support, because this will and support will somehow empower them and will also motivate them to perform better, but they also should be immune from political interference. They should be independent from political interference to reveal unethical conduct whenever it exists, okay? And also wherever it exists. So they should be immune in order to be objective in their work, in order not to fear any possible retaliations or revenge against them, and so on. With regard to the internal factors that are related to the anti corruption agencies themselves, well, it is important that these anti corruption agencies ensure adequate staff funding. So they should offer all the necessary financial resources to their staff in order to enable them to perform their work in the best possible way. And also, they need to cut red tape, meaning that they should not be confined to strict rules. They should have more comprehensive authorities that would allow them to do their work in the best possible way. But this does not mean that they would have full authorities to even bend rules or something like this. No, this is not what is meant by cutting red tape, but they should be following flexible regulations that would enable them to handle different circumstances, handle different organizations and different practices inside the organizations in order to perform their job in the best possible way. A third internal factor would be to reduce opportunities for corruption, meaning to ensure that they have the proper salaries, that they are independent, that they are autonomous from any possible retaliation, and so on. So you should offer your staff with privileges that would make them immune from the chance of becoming corrupt. And fourth, also punish the guilty. In case any unethical act happened, you should um, immediately punish those who are involved in corruption and never close an eye on them, because actually these anti-corruption agencies are supposed to reveal unethical acts. So in case those people become corrupt themselves, then they need to be punished. Okay? But of course, in reality, it is difficult to have all these conditions, so organizations have to balance as much as possible between internal factors and external factors that might help them achieve their success and perform their job in the most possible way.